Between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, nomadic hunter-gatherers crossed the Bering Strait, beginning a generations-long journey south through the Americas. By 1600 BC, the dense tropical forests of the Yucatan Peninsula were settled by their descendants, a people who would become known as the Mayans. The mythical and mysterious Mayan civilization was once a large collection of city-states in Mesoamerica, composed of over 70 distinct languages, but unified by ancestry, religion, and culture. These groups interacted through a complex network of trade routes, alliances, and rivalries. They fought epic, large-scale wars against each other, and frequently enslaved or sacrificed captured soldiers from other Mayan tribes. But even by ancient standards, the Mayans were far from being primitive or underdeveloped. Archaeological records prove that they were extraordinary mathematicians and astronomers. They built breathtaking pyramids, temples, palaces, and plazas that stood the test of time. They had a unique writing system, composed of hieroglyphics and used for a variety of records and stone carvings. There were at least 2 million Mayans during the peak of the classical period, at around 600 AD. Mayan society rivaled that of other significant ancient cultures by virtually every metric. But at around 800 AD, Mayans abandoned the Yucatan Peninsula. Their greatest cities were deserted. This mass exodus has long perplexed historians, and to this day, its causes are unknown. Perhaps it was a drought, or a major war. But whatever it was, one thing was certain. The Mayans never again reached the heights of civilization seen during their classical era. But contrary to some popular misconceptions, they did not just vanish entirely. Their civilization continued on for hundreds of years, albeit in a state of undeniable decline. The expedition of Christopher Columbus in 1492 shifted the tides of world history forever. The Spanish brought with them guns, horses, disease, and Christianity. A mere 50 years after landing at the shores of a continent later called America, most of its land was already claimed as part of the Spanish Empire. Their aggressive invasion left unspeakable death, destruction, and some might argue, genocide in its path. But the Mayans proved to be a more challenging foe than Spain was expecting. Their decentralized network of cities and relentless adherence to cultural tradition made them difficult to conquer. It wasn't until the 1700s that the remaining Mayan strongholds fell for good. Almost the entire New World had been conquered by Spain come the mid-1500s, but such vast stretches of land were impossible to control in practice. British pirates were a particular nuisance on the seas. They raided Spanish ports and trade routes, robbed cargo ships in the Caribbean, and stole logwood, the area's most abundant resource. The pirates, called buccaneers, were not formally controlled by the Crown, allowing London a degree of plausible deniability concerning their actions. But there was no mistaking that, with or without direct involvement, buccaneers aided British interests. A group of buccaneers, known as baymen, pushed the limits of Spain's territorial claim. They settled along the Bay of Honduras in 1638, defiantly founding Belize town. The settlement, primarily made of woodcutters, continued to grow in size. Their presence infuriated the Spanish. A series of conflicts and treaties further legitimized the Belize settlement as decades went on, even as nearby Spanish colonists attempted invasion half a dozen times during the 1700s. Britain, seeing vast potential in mahogany as a source of commerce, imported African slaves from nearby Caribbean colonies to work as laborers. In 1798, the Spanish sent their biggest force yet, an army of 2,000 soldiers by sea, and fought the baymen and their slaves in the Battle of St. George's Caye. British victory was so decisive that Spain never attempted to reclaim the area again. The victory at St. George's Caye paved the way for Belize's continued development. Population grew at a faster pace, and larger towns were constructed in wake of amplified activity. Growth was mainly motivated by the lumber industry, but as years went on, wood exports sunk to increasingly lower levels, and Belize's lack of economic diversification made the settlement vulnerable to recession. Bitter disagreement on how to tackle this economic crisis created a rift between landowners, who controlled the forestry industry, and merchants who controlled trade. Landowners advocated an increase in tariffs, while the merchants preferred to increase land tax. Naturally, each faction opposed the other vehemently. Such bitter disagreement in the midst of worsening economic conditions led to greater intervention from London. In 1862, Belize was declared a crown colony and renamed to British Honduras. The dispute between landowners and merchants therefore became irrelevant overnight. Just over a decade later, in 1875, half of all land in the territory was owned by the Belize Estate and Produce Company, a London-based corporation that would hold significant influence in the colony over the next century. Their rise signified the end of the old settler elite. In 1931, a hurricane destroyed nearly all of Belize Town, killed thousands, and started off an even worse decade, which devastated the wood industry due to the global Great Depression. Growing groups of Creole and Mestizo demanded political representation and began to organize around nationalist pro-worker movements like the People's Unity Party. Political reform gained Britain's blessing by the middle of the 20th century. In 1954, the PUP won 66% of the vote in Belize's first parliamentary elections, and George Price became Belize's first prime minister. British Honduras was renamed into Belize in the 1970s and governed autonomously from that point forward. But official independence was still complicated by a territorial dispute with neighboring Guatemala, which stretched back to the 1800s. A tense standoff at the Belize-Guatemala border ended in 1981 when the UN General Assembly passed a resolution supporting Belizean independence, and Belize finally became its own independent country.